My name's Mike Carlson. I'm originally a petroleum engineer. When the downturn occurred in the oil and gas industry, I went back to school and took information system security at SAIT. And I've been working on emails mostly here for the last couple of years, as well as some network access control and uh, AV. And one of the things that I've discovered in this process is understanding exploit kits is really important for filtering email. So I'll get into it here. The outline of what I'm going to talk about here is phishing is actually really important. It's a major component, according to SANS, in over 90% of breaches. And when we're looking at defending, we actually only have to break one of those links in order to be successful. So one of the things we need to do is understand how an exploit kit works. And the exploit kits have been designed basically for the benefit of the hackers. They're actually trying to hurt us. And I'll give you a little bit about history and then talk a little bit about the tricky part in security, which is the techniques, tactics, and processes. And we have got a nice little picture there of David Bianco's pyramid of pain, I believe he called it. So the first thing to understand about an exploit kit is it's very flexible. So you could have a variety of different ways in which you can access this. One of these is somebody goes to a website and then they click on a malicious advertisement link, then it sends you to what people call a landing server. Now, there's other ways that you can do this as well. You could go to a compromised site directly and it actually automatically takes you to a landing server. And then finally, and this is where the email comes in with the little yellow arrow there, you click on a link inside an email, takes you to a landing server. Now, this landing server is an intermediate step. After that, you end up at what's called the exploit server kit, and it actually downloads the malware, and that can take a variety of forms, and this is another form of flexibility here. It could be ransomware, could be a branking Trojan, which is very common. It could be malware, and typically when we're talking about malware, we're usually talking about a remote access Trojan, and it usually leads to some command and control activity. So here's where things get a little bit more complex, and you'll notice that I've used a series of different diagrams here, and that's not really intended to cause confusion, although it might a little bit. The key thing here is that with all this flexibility and all these different exploit kits, people have different ways of explaining what's going on, and then also there are also different ways that the exploit kits run, so they're not all exactly the same. So once again, we see our victim here. He goes to a bad malicious website, and then it directs somebody else directs him onto somewhere else. And then you'll notice that there's a little zigzag in here. And very often, this is done for 3 or 4 different servers before you finally get to the exploit server. And then you can see in this one, they've also separated the function of delivering the malware. So what does this allow people to do? Well, usually what happens, say you get a link from Constant Contact. It's a reputable company. Rather than going to that website and going to your website directly, it sends you to another website that directs you to another website that sends you to another website that directs you to another website. And what they're allowing themselves to do here is if one of their compromised websites, which is hosting one of the malware servers or exploit servers, gets compromised, or in other words, taken down, they can actually zigzag their way through a variety of these things and then finally get you to an exploit server, even if some of these sites get taken down. If Constant Contact checks the first redirector and says, all right, this looks like a legitimate site, I don't see any malware on there, it has the redirector on there, and so to actually find the malicious website, you have to go down 3 or 4 layers. So this allows you a certain amount of protection in not being caught right up at the front end. VirusTotal won't have all of these different website servers on here, and it allows you to get to the exploit server, or for the hacker that is, without actually having any problems there. So one of the things that we want to take a look at here is we talked about, we have this landing server. In this landing server, we have some decisions that are made on to which page gets loaded down. So this is actually from one of the publications of the government in the UK. It's the CERT UK. And what they do here is they take a look. Is there any AV detection on this computer? Can we find it? Do we know what the OS detection is? And most browsers will actually serve up that information. Maybe it's not a target that we're really interested in. Say we're targeting utilities in Canada or airlines in Canada. Well, it'll say, oh, look, this is actually somebody working in a retail store. It's coming from a university. What they do then is they send it to a non-malicious web page. And what they're trying to do here is they don't want to have somebody download their malware for something that's not of interest to them, and then only to have somebody come along and say, hey, yeah, I downloaded some malware here, and then have somebody sandbox it and figure out what it does. Now, here's another really important step. It takes a look at the browser. Can this browser be exploited? So in the classic terms, Internet Explorer the Microsoft product had a reputation for being full of security holes. If that was the case versus, say, maybe a Chromium, and there are browser exploits for Chromium as well, what happens then is it says, all right, I found a target that I have an exploit for. Then it takes that exploit, and the exploit may not be directly in the browser itself. It might actually be in one of the plugins. And then finally here you go do nothing or redirect to a fake page. And I think in a lot of cases here, that fake page actually turns out to be a credential theft. And one of the big advantages of an exploit kit is you always have an exit to something that really works. So this second star on the page before, which is this one here, is the origin of what people call the drive-by download. If you have the right browser or the right plugin, and they have available to them the right exploit, and most of these were originally associated with JavaScript and or Flash Player, the malware can be downloaded without the user having to click. Now, most of these exploits have now been cleaned up in the last few years. However, this doesn't mean that that's the end of it. And I think one of the things that's also important about exploit kits is, for the most part, what they're serving up is usually not a zero-day exploit. Usually, and this is from a number of papers on this, you find that the exploits that are actually being used are actually well known. And you can see they've got CVE numbers. Some of these are for 2015, which is 5 years ago. Some of these go further back. Some of the more recent ones aren't included in this paper because it's not super recent. But you can see here Java is used, Flash is used, the Internet Explorer itself, PDF documents can be used, and then Adobe Flash was immensely popular. And actually, I think it's at the point now where there are relatively few versions of Adobe Flash that are still operating. People have taken those off their systems because this has sort of been the death knell of Adobe Flash until they come up with something that's substantially more secure. You can see that the Microsoft Silverlight here, this is the Microsoft server as well, that has vulnerabilities in it as well. So there's more to an exploit kit yet again. And the key point here is they're manageable. Once again, here, this is from the CERT UK. This diagram somewhat confusingly starts on the other side of the page. I do note that in the UK, they drive on the wrong side of the road. But we start with our victim here. The victim goes to the compromised site, gets redirected to a landing page, and then you'll see that in here, you can see that there's somebody over here on the left-hand side that's the exploit kit customer. He's looking at a management interface, can see the exploit kit, and he can see as these different exploits are being downloaded. And then at the bottom here on the left-hand side, again here, you can see we've got a reference to 2 CVEs, both from 2015 in this case, the exploit kit author. So now we have a somewhat more complicated situation than just some, kids, working in his basement as a, quote, script kiddie. We actually have separate players in here, and this has actually become a business now. And you can see here they've picked banking trojans and ransomwares. This evaluation stage, once again, is very important. You can see in this particular case, they're only referring to 2 CVEs, but, there are more exploits available, and this is one of the things that the author will offer is a variety of different exploits, and then the person who buys this thing, the exploit kit customer, can pick and choose which one of these exploits that he wants to use. And there's some, of course, option or opportunity to figure out what the profile of your customer is. Say you're working with an oil company in Calgary. The vast majority of oil companies in Calgary, the people that are working in there are working on the Microsoft environment. They're probably not serving up Linux exploits. They may have some Mac exploits, and in fact, if they're dealing with executives, a high proportion of executives in some of the companies I've worked with happen to like Macs. So here we are. We have a cast of characters now. In this particular case, I've got a new diagram here. Somebody sends a spam email. Our victim goes there and clicks on the link, goes to the landing page, ends up with an exploit kit being downloaded. You can see the customer is in there as well. And then you can see that this one here, they've got a third character here that I've shown with number 4. And this person is the kit admin. And he's the person that's busy loading these exploits up on various servers. So what does that look like? Oh, sorry. So one day, in the process of doing a sandbox, I came across this funny looking page, and you'll notice on here in the left-hand side, it says infect. And what this is it's a management page for reloading up your exploit kit onto the server. And in actual fact, the way this works is when they compromise one of these servers and they get into it, most commonly it's a WordPress server, but there's other opportunities as well. They install their own web page on that compromised server, usually under some other directory so that nobody notices, and they have an automated system that does this. Usually it's uploaded in a zip file, and if you'll see a little bit later in the conversation here when we're talking about this, that you can sometimes find these zip files, or they leave them behind when the website's compromised. If you're ever in the position of actually having to clean one of these things up, certainly would be nice if somebody kept a copy of these things so that they can be used or analyzed later on. So there's a couple of other things that these exploit kits often have in them, and that is you'll find that they now have CAPTCHAs in them. And what they're trying to do here is to stop automated processing. If you talk to your local Microsoft salesman, he'll tell you about all of the wonderful things that APT does, and that it does an automatic quote detonation, which is another word for running a sandbox. However, if you put one of these CAPTCHAs in here, you'll never get to the point where you download any payload unless you can get past the CAPTCHA. And I've picked one of the ones here that I happen to like because it's a little bit more unusual. It's not the usual picture of a fire hydrant or a crosswalk or a bridge. You can see that what they've done is they put in these little random lines in here. I call them squiggles, and those things help people prevent AI from being used on the CAPTCHAs. One of the important implications of this is that when you're out there trying to decide on which sandbox kit you should use, one of the things that could be very important is the ability to do manual input. And that's also one of the major limitations of, quote, automatic detonation. Sounds wonderful, but it doesn't necessarily get you to the end, which is seeing what the payload is that they're downloading. Okay, let's move on here. Oh, I know. Yep. So we talked about the kit admin at number 4 here, but let's go take a little bit of a look here at our customer at number 5. So number 5 here is our customer here. He's sitting in there. He's hired the kit developer. He gets this package, and he too gets a management console. So while he's actively running his network of malicious web pages, he'll get this kit that shows, and it comes, this one here is called Black Hole. And actually, this is an interesting case as well. Black Hole was 4 or 5 years old. It was extremely successful. And the reason they were able to get this entire kit was somebody actually managed to purchase one as a lab researcher and got the whole kit. And there's a really good write-up by Dell, and you can see exactly how this whole thing works when you look at that. So let's get into some of the details here, because some of these details are important. So I like this diagram because it's got the victim in here and what happens to him. We've got a little bit here about what happens on the websites they visit. He goes and visits a compromised website. He gets redirected to this other website in here. This website sends him to a DNS server, and then you'll see that there's a name server in here that goes on from the primary DNS server to the secondary DNS server, and that they used a lot of DGA, which is a domain-generated algorithm, and it creates basically a random number so that, it's very hard to track these websites. It's important. It's not on a primary DNS server because that's public and people can follow that. It basically goes to a private web server or DNS server here, and that allows them to redirect you to another website that's very temporary. It may be only up for one use, and then it sends you back to the landing page. You get the exploit kit. The exploit kit in this case here is shown with a flash. When that flash is sent back and forth here, it gets obfuscated by using a packer. And it not only encrypts it, but actually also makes the executable smaller so that it takes up less web bandwidth. Then the exploitation gets run. The exploitation kit actually downloads malware, and then that comes back as a second event in here. And then this is where something such as a remote access Trojan or ransomware would get installed. And then you can see here in this case, they've demonstrated this with a malware CNC. So this is a very common feature where they use the generated names. It's not absolutely a necessity. There's a little bit of a page in here that outlines how the DNS works. It goes to a primary DNS server, then you can go to a secondary, and then you can go to a tertiary DNS server. And in many cases, they will use more than one DNS server so that nobody can come back later on and track down the IP for where these things actually occurred. So in trying to understand these exploit kits, one of the other things we need to do is we need to understand something about the browser. Now, it's actually quite difficult to find information on browsers. I have a paper here, Grosskirth and Godfrey. This is a group of people that work at the University of Waterloo. And what they've done there is they've made up a generic. And the reason it's so hard to find is many of the browsers are proprietary. Now, I'm thinking specifically of something like Internet Explorer or Chromium here. In the case of Firefox, that's actually a public domain thing, and it's Mozilla. But you'll notice that the way the HTML documents work are set up, they have slightly different terminology. Although they work functionally more or less the same, if you look at a web page in Chrome or Firefox or in Safari, there'll always be subtle differences in the layout. And that's because the people, when they design these things, set them up slightly differently. So this may be not directly important to what you're doing here, but you have to make sure that the sandbox you have has the right browser in there. You also helps to understand these things so that when you set your sandbox up, you want to make sure that you match what's in your actual production environment. So once again, going to the nuts and bolts details again here, when I talked about 8 and 9 and the fact that the transfers are obfuscated with encryption and compression, this means that if you were to say, take a look at this from a network traffic point of view, you would not be able to see entirely what's happening here as it's coming into your system. So then we can talk a little bit about 8 and 9 is where the payload gets delivered. And if we look at this as well, we can see that there are papers that outline how the obfuscators and packers have been set up. And you'll see this is for an exploit kit that was, or two of them actually, the nuclear exploit kit and the rig exploit kit. And you can see that they change these packers around as time goes by. So this is helpful for identifying which of the exploit kits is being used. And then maybe more importantly here, I've switched to another one here now. This is the nuclear exploit kit. And they've looked at a specific period during 2014. You can see that they've got these little hash numbers in here. And And what's happened is they've changed the key and they've changed the style of the packer and obfuscator. And then also as time goes by, they also change the payloads. So, and then on top of that, you can have the same exploit kit with different payloads depending on what it is you want. So why did people go to all this bother in here? And where would you find out all of this information? And the truth is that in exploit kits, it can be quite difficult. I've got a picture here. This is off the cover of the No Starch Ghidra handbook. And, you know, when you take one of these things apart, you get into doing disassembly in here of assembly language. And when that happens, you end up with a very complex flowcharts. This is specialized, very time consuming, difficult to obtain. As I showed from the previous slide, it changes relatively frequently. And very often, unless you get to the point where you're fairly far down in the process where you've actually got the download to occur and the exploit to be installed, you won't necessarily see any of these things, because unless you have the exact right exploit, it won't actually do anything. So I have a little list here. I don't think it's exhaustive at this point in time here. This one's from about 2 or 3 years ago. You can see that there's an enormous number of exploit kits that have been developed over the years. They kind of tend to come and go, and there's usually about 3 or 4 at any one given time that are popular. But one of the things I wanted to do was to contrast this with what happens with traditional malware. And this is, you know, off the cover of, once again, a No Starch book, Practical Malware Analysis. So in the past, when we got a malware, it came as an attachment. It might have been a PDF diagram, might be in an HTML file, or it might be an exe file. So usually what happens is you downloaded it, you could put it in a sandbox and execute it, and it would have the entire process in there, the unpack, the deobfuscation. You could use a standard, you know, process that was discussed earlier today by AJ Leese, and which would be contained in this practical malware analysis. You'd try and unpack it, you'd scan it for strings, load it into a disassembler, and somewhere along the way run it in a sandbox as well. Well, when we have an exploit kit, the links to it are ephemeral. They disappear. You've got 4 or 5 of them that go in a row, so you're basically going through a maze to get there. It evaluates your target machine. So when it downloads that payload, it doesn't download the payload for, well, if this is like a Stuxnet virus, you know, if this is a Siemens controller, do this. If it's another brand of controller, don't do anything. Basically, it only will get downloaded if there's a viable response. And the reason they're doing this is so that they can minimize the analysis that it gets done on their kits, and it extends the tool life. So usually their fallback is to a web-based credential phish, meaning they take you to something like a Microsoft Office 365 page. And, you know, because this has now become a business, they're usually prepackaged mix and match systems. And once again, we talked a little bit about this. They're now manageable and supported tools. People get some fairly direct feedback as to what kind of machines they're running into, how quickly people are exploited on them. And, you know, if they have a target, they can see whether or not they're actually getting through to that target. So I'm going to go out here on a bit of a limb and make a prediction here, because I think this has already happened. I think exploit kits will continue to dominate. If you look at the email analysis programs, this is reports from things like Avanon and Proofpoint. Exploits kits are starting to dominate. Most phishing emails now have links in them. They're way more flexible. They come pre-packaged, readily available. You know, if the rig exploit kit stops performing, you can go out and buy the nuclear one. And I think they have a higher damage potential. Now, we also heard a discussion earlier today about threat hunting. Kyle gave a talk on that. I think this is important here, is that every time somebody sends one of these things out, you actually have a direct contact with the enemy, and they have to show their hand to some degree. Yes, the IPs have changed a lot. Yes, the web pages come and go. However, the techniques that they use, meaning which exploit kit they choose, and we need to take a look a little bit at also the process of how they would do this and sending it out. So I have here a picture here of one of the current exploit kits. This is from Zscaler, and they're looking at their rig exploit kit. And you can see that it's being used fairly broadly throughout the world in Europe, United States. They don't put Canada on there, but Russia seems to be fairly popular as well. And what would we do in order to try and stop this? We've got this contact with the enemy. What we're really trying to do is prevent it. So if we look at the process involved in hacking a website, or maybe more to the point, getting into a company, we send out an email, the email has a link, and then we get into this process where we want to get an initial compromise, establish a foothold. Usually that's somebody clicking on an email and they get a CNC server. Then they want to escalate privileges or do an internal recon. And I've pulled this one out of another book here. This is how you would get into a cloud service. In this case, the order has been slightly reversed in here. They've gotten an internal recon, found a token or a cookie for a website, use that to get into a web service, and bingo, they've got the information they want. So we kind of want to understand what it is they're doing in here so that we can find what's happening here. We also want to understand how that how that initial compromise occurs, because if we can stop the initial compromise. So let's go back to our diagram about how the exploit kit works. Well, if we sandbox, or we have somebody that clicks inside the company and they get compromised, we have all the information that's shown in the green box here. We can see the HTML code that came from the compromised website. We can see the JavaScript that'll get recorded. We'll get an iframe as one technique that we may use in order to accomplish this. In this case, they have a flash for the exploit. You'll get some fingerprint on the flash, and then you can take a look at the malware. The malware has to get downloaded and unpacked. However, that's not our only sort of information. We could, like I described earlier, also do a PCAP analysis on all the information as it goes back and forth. And then you'll recall I had a page there where I got into the management page for compromising a website. Well, when that happens, you have some insight as to what's going on. And if you happen to know somebody that hosted one of these websites, you can actually see what's in there. And before they take it down, you can do a forensic analysis on there and even get the zip file that actually sets up the website that does the compromising. The exploit kits are usually dispensed separately, and this was once again another indication of the compartmentalization that's used to protect the exploit kit. If you could get to one of these, and these are normally located offshore, but once again, law enforcement in France or in Russia takes one of these things down, and then also you have the opportunity in some circumstances to actually get to the DNS server and see how it's set up and see how the domain generation occurs. So in most cases, we're probably most interested in what's happening in that green area. So what have we done historically for countermeasures? And the answer to that is normally we keep track of the bad IPs. We would go to virus total and see, okay, well, what do we have in here in terms of do we recognize this website? And if the website's recognized, well, then you have a reputation. But if the website's compromised, which is usually the case these days, there's no reputation at all. It's not a brand new website, so it's an established domain. Usually the SPF, DKIM, and ARCs are legit, and people know these users. We still see a lot of Office 365 password expiries and HTML voicemails, but I think that the proportion of these is, based on my experience, getting smaller. And lately, I've seen a number of fake advertising, and some of these are quite technical, like literally people talking about technical geology or technical engineering, which is in my background, geological engineer, and I go, wow, look at that. And then when another one would be conferences. When I've gone out and sandboxed those things, I find they come up as being malicious. So we need to spend quite a bit of time looking at spam these days as well. So what are the implications of all this? We can do forensics on the payload. Usually when the forensics team comes in, it's too late. You've already got a compromised server. We have endpoint protections. We have AV, and we have things like Secure Connector or Sysmon. We can buy PCAPs literally off the web that have the web traffic for these things. A number of researchers have set up watering holes in here. They set this thing up so that people send emails to them, and then they go and run this thing. So it's not, there are ways of getting this done. In most cases, these links only last for 3 or 4 hours. If they're not done within 3 or 4 hours, it's too late. People have moved on. They've taken down the website or changed. And then you have a situation where if you want to understand what happened, somebody clicked on a website, they tell you about it the next day, you can't go back the next day and see what that exploit kit would have done, because when you click on the link, everything's already dead. So there are other opportunities. Researchers have purchased kits. I talked about compromised websites. You can get the web kit there. And then there's also the possibility that somebody will take a management takedown. However, in most cases, these are conveniently located in difficult jurisdictions. And I'm going to suggest that what we really need is something that's actionable for the majority of people like you and I. So one of the things that I think is underutilized is recognizing the pattern. If we do a simulated phishing program, what do? We prepare an email list. How do we do that? Usually we download a list of all the people in the company from Active Directory. However, if we were working at this from the other side, we would do an OSINT, we'd do an open source intelligence gathering. We'd select the exploit kit. In something like Proofpoint, we would select the email template. In that case, the payload is just literally going to the software as a service for Proofpoint. In a real case, it would be different, but this is really what we're trying to find. We would also set up a schedule on this thing here, and then we would monitor our results. Now, we can actually use email spam filters and things like that. It does work. It works to a point. There's things in there that can be triggered off wording. But in a lot of cases, and I'll give an example of an accounts payable invoice, we get an invoice. They commonly come in HTML files, and a lot of the fish we see now look exactly like what would be legitimate emails. So this means we need to sandbox. So sandboxing requires a couple of things. One thing, we have to get past the first link because it's a redirect. Some will be down, and in fact, this is one of the things that we can use as an indicator. We'll need to get, in many cases, past the CAPTCHA, and a lot of them actually track to see whether or not there's mouse movement. So if you just moving your mouse around will actually have an effect. And then most malware now has detection for virtual machines, and there is the option of actually having little NUC type based physical sandboxes, and you will get different results based on my experimentation. And once again, the objective here is to get to the payload. Here's another little trick that I think is underutilized. If you take this thing here through manually and get to the end, you'll get to, if nothing else, a credential page, and it'll say, enter your credential. Well, I put in some dummy credentials, I put in there, bang, bang, bang at, companyname.com. And then my password would be don't pay bad girls. But if you actually set that up so that it actually went to a mailbox or went to an actual login, once again, you don't want it connected to anything in your environment. You want it to be connected to something isolated. All of a sudden now you have a direct connection to where the bad guys are actually sitting, and you can see where they are. So one of the things that's really interesting is these things will actually test in real time while you're actually running that exploit kit. It'll come back. It'll almost always say, you need to enter your password twice. And that's just simply so that they can confirm your password. But if you put in one of these dummy credentials, it'll come back and say, yeah, that password or that account doesn't exist. So they're actually in the background checking to make sure that they can't log into your system. So here we go. One of the things that's really important here, and this is what happens if you get a clicker. You send out an alert, and the alert comes back, and somebody says, hey, I'm sorry, I clicked on that yesterday. And the next question is, what do I have to do to remediate this? Once again, we had a discussion earlier today where AJ Lees talked about remediation and what you would do. Actually, knowing what's in that sandbox results and forwarding those to your SIEM or your SOC will help those people to know what to look for. There may actually be in there things like which CNC IP on there. You might know whether or not it was set up, to what kind of software it downloaded. All very important information. So what else can we look for in an email? All of these things have styles. I saw that these ones that were technical conferences and things had a particular style, and it wasn't actually that hard. Very difficult to put that into words and put that into an AI type thing, but you'll see a lot of them use URL shorteners. A lot of the customer systems are compromised. So, you have a doctor's office, the doctor's using Constant Contact. Somebody breaks in, gets a credential theft in there. You use the credential theft to get into the Constant Contact. All of a sudden, working at a utility company, you get this thing from this doctor's office in Santa Clara, and it's all got the links that go to what you would normally think was a safe location, which is a Constant Contact link. So they have to prepare these mail lists. They're prepared from intelligence. One of the things that's really interesting is I see in some of these that they'll have the same email list, almost identical, and there's even the same mistake. Somebody's repeated a name twice. You'll see that they're often targeted specifically to only the users. Very often the size of the list and the variety of the senders indicates resources, and also, that people are reusing things. So I have an example here. This is, actual field data. You can see here in this particular case that, we've got this massive campaign, 800, 1,780 emails. You can see there's some 60, 70 almost domains that have been used. Comes from 65 or 63 different countries. And then you can take a look at those email lists, and they look surprisingly similar. So they're very often using that same list. You can imagine that to have resources, and actually these get progressively more recent as you get up to the top in here. At the bottom here, they were starting out with 30 or 40 different countries. As they get more and more, as their network gets bigger, they're getting more and more countries in here. You see on average, they only send an email or an email in here, and this is all designed to prevent automated phish detection. They'll have 1, 2, or 3 different emails that come from an individual source. So, if you take, say, something like the Proofpoint Analyzer, it sees over 200 emails with the same title, and it'll say, oh, this has got to be a phish, this is a campaign. Well, you'll find that they have, when you take a look at the subjects, that the subject has a 4-sequence number in there of DGA numbers that are randomly generated. These subjects never appear to be exactly the same. All of these are indicators that you can use to find that, oh, we've got an organized phishing campaign. So when we get into the actual sandbox, it's tremendously detailed. I showed some of the stuff that was there before when you did actual disassembly. But there are some gross sort of overriding things in here, and this is actually from Joe's sandbox. You can see that it takes a look at the functional grouping. Is this a Trojan? Does it have an evasion in it? Is it an exploiter? Does it have spyware in there? It has a little bit of a flow diagram. Well, here I have an example here of a series of different ones that were run, fairly close together in terms of time. We have one in here that shows up as malicious, picked up by a snort signature. And then we have another one that's, immediately, almost at exactly the same time. The two flowcharts look exactly the same. Well, depending on the packer or the obfuscator and things like that, this snort picked this one up, but it didn't pick that one up. And the truth is, the sandbox still rely heavily on signatures. If you go into Cuckoo or something like that, you see one that rates a 10 out of 10. It's usually been picked up by 2 or more virus signatures. But the behavior is almost identical from other ones that, only rate a 2 or 3 or 4. And then I have another example here. Once again, I'm looking for similarities, and I'm looking at the flowchart here. Those two look almost exactly the same. You can see it comes down. There's 2 big black boxes there and a smaller one off to the right there. This one here is a little bit different. It's a big black box, 2 little bit. But then you look at this one here in this series in here. This one's been flagged as malicious. Once again, that'll be a signature. You can see in a number of these, they have some, snowflake, snowflake, snowflake. You can see they have similar, these ones here have similar programs, and very often you'll find that that's how you find them is you take a look at these things in here. All of these things here are polymorphic enough that they aren't easily recognized. So how do you decide which ones are bad and which ones are good? I have an example here. This happens to be a Cuckoo Sandbox. I ran it against Memory Express. It's a company here in town that sells computer hardware, computers, not so much software, but accessories. Probably everybody in here has been to, in Calgary has been to Memory Express at some time. I looked at their website here. You can see they have an ad for an office opening in Ottawa. It comes up as a 2.4 out of 10, which is relatively clean. You'll notice that, once again, we go back to understanding a little bit about running the browsers. It loads material on the heap. It has some executable files. It does a couple of things that you might not, hopefully, that it wouldn't do. It uses some Windows utilities for basic Windows functionality. Potential heap spray, 149 megabytes. Resumed a suspended thread, potential indication of process injection. Okay, well then let's take a look at some stuff that came up a little bit worse. We've got one that came up as a 4.7. Here we are, raised a Suricata alert. Suricata and SNART are both intrusion detection systems. Dropped 64 unknown file types in here. MIME types. So this is an attachment indicating ransomware. Well, that's not a good sign. So that's probably why this one got a 4.7. You can see this one here is download an agenda. It's for a conference. Contacts an IP that is no longer responding. And you'll notice we had earlier on that zigzag pattern of flipping through websites. This is the indication that some of them have already been taken down. Heap spray, but the heap spray is now very large. It's 2.74 or 2740 megabytes, which is really big. That's 2.7 gig. That's a big file download. You can see in the next one down here, communicates to DNS or commutes to a host without a DNS lookup. So it's got a hardwired IP. That's another indication. Contacts IPs that are no longer responding. Once again, that's similar to the behavior we saw up in here. So in this case, I'm looking at stuff that it's, more in the 4.7 range, which is above the 2.4. But then if I look at some other examples, and I'll just go to the one here at the end here, which was definitely malicious. This was a really tricky one. It had an SPF fail, looked like it came from Microsoft. In fact, it did come from Microsoft. It came from a hacked server. But the score on this one's only 1.7. And here it is, Microsoft sign-in. Once again, another one here at 2. This is a shared business file. This is one of these ones where we send out a proposal. Once again, also another hacked site. So you do actually have to look at the screenshots. And of course, in this case here, you can see people are saying, oh, yeah, we'll help you download your new browser update, which of course is a polite way of saying, please open our malware. So I have some summary here. General cutoff 2.4. Look at the login screen. If it's got a cred harvest, well, it could be as low as 1.6. Look for larger heap sprays. Anything over maybe 250. Unknown MIME types are a bad sign. IPS and IDS alerts are bad. The dead URLs, bad. If you look at this one, you'll see this one goes to a website in here. It doesn't actually, or not a web, yeah, I think it's a website, but it's called hotwheels.shop, and it's got a login. There's a company logo associated with this that I've whited out. And then look at the flow diagrams, see what they look like compared to stuff that is malicious. And then finally, you'll see very often sometimes you get a direct to IP without a DNS lookup, but anything more than 1 or 2 is bad sign. So we're always hoping that we can make these things automated. And I have some automated, summary here of how you might go about this. User awareness, of course, is really important. We spend a lot of money on that now. We run all these simulated programs. There are, for instance, say on emails, software detection programs out there. They usually have a combination of things in there. A blacklist, heuristics, which is basically a rule like a transport rule, some visual similarity, which would be your eyeballing the thing, and then also machine learning. You can key off particular words in there, and you can see in here that, for instance, on spam identification, people have used support vector machine and other forms of AI to figure out. And then, of course, you've got your sandbox in here. You can automate the sandbox in here as well. URLs in the memory, dropped files, behavioral analysis. And then I'm almost done here. Got a couple of other last interesting little things here. This was a paper on somebody that had been basically trolling the web, doing a web mining thing in here. And they found all these exploit kits. And they found in one address, so this is an indicator of compromise, where the people that were running the exploit kits actually had the exploit kit phone home when something happened, when they got somebody. And they found that they had this one wire Z at googledocs.org that showed up in 115 different sites. So there are, based on research, indicators of compromise that you can use. So what else can you do? And there was an interesting talk here not long ago put on by Calsec. They had some guys in there with Sentinel-1. They came in and did a simulation with that they did with MITRE on our APT29 attacks. SE Labs, which is a company in the UK, they've tested a number of different email evaluation packages, and they actually simulate what would be a threat profile for various attackers and see how it works. And then there's another company out here, this is based in Europe, I think, Virus Bulletin, and they do a comparative review of how these different things work. And the difficulty we have here is we've got lots of vendors that are, and they sponsor the conference, that are out there marketing their products. And, I think that this is very sincere and that they're doing their best. There's a little bit of serendipity in making sure that you get access to all the information on these exploit kits. They're difficult to analyze because of all these different varieties. But, how do you determine from various marketing claims which one works better than the next? And I think for both the companies making these things and also for the potential buyers, taking a look at these test examples really helps a lot. And overall, I think it'll be better for both users and suppliers if they have some quantitative method of testing how their products work. So here we are at the end. I have some conclusions here. Exploit kits are really a dynamic ecosystem. They're very flexible. They started out in 2006, and they appear to be persisting. A number of people thought that with the demise of the Internet Explorer, of course, Microsoft has now migrated to their Edge product, which is basically a rebranded Chromium with Microsoft features. And that has not actually resulted in the death of the exploit kits at all. The guiding factors or the protection of the exploit kit that makes this popular have not gone away. I think they're more dangerous than the traditional malware. The traditional malware, you could dissect it using conventional malware analysis. That's time-consuming and difficult, but now you only get little bits and pieces unless you work at it really hard. And I'm going to suggest that, as you're going through evaluating your emails, because these links are ephemeral and the exploit kits change rapidly, if you want to know what you're going to need to do in order to remediate, you have to be taking samples every once in a while to see how things are going. And finally, we're in the security business, and it's people are now calling this a bit of a cyber war, and whether that's true or not, maybe not important. Know yourself, know your enemy. You want to be taking a look at these different things and understand what they're doing, and that will help you better plan your security program, and it's important to know that. That's pretty much everything I had to say. It is now currently 16:48, which means I got a couple of minutes here before 3:50, and that leaves about 5 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions, uh, please, by all means, fire away. Okay, I had a question here. Dominance of rootkits. Rootkits are only one aspect of the fishing in there, and a lot of what we actually see, in my opinion, appears to be command and control, and that's really a remote access Trojan. But a rootkit is also, of course, something else that people could do. Don't know if that really answers your question, but I think that yeah, okay, I see. You mentioned the exploitation kit. Yeah, it's not that we don't ever get anything in there. We still get the audio HTMLs, and those actually have links in them now, so they're actually also a form of exploit kit. And with people being able to buy these things sort of on a commercial basis, it's very quick to implement, and it doesn't take. You can imagine that when you set one of these things up there, when you build a web page, you need a PHP component to it. They probably don't have to do a database backend in there, but then you've also got some significant programming in terms of putting in the JavaScript in there to make the whole thing work. And so, you actually need a fair amount of technical expertise to build one of these exploit kits. Plus, then on top of that, you have to be able to deliver the actual exploit itself. That's pretty much it. Anybody else have any other questions? Okay, I had a question here on whether I think IPv6 will have any effect in that area. Not that I can think of, but that may just mean I'm relatively new to the security business, so that may just mean I don't know. One last thing in here. I actually put some references in here as well if you're interested in knowing more information about these specific things. You can use the presentation, and I'll find some way of getting this uploaded as a PDF so that people can go through it. And there's a variety of sources in here. I actually find, because exploit kits are so new, there's less in the academic world and a lot more in the commercial sources. And you can see some companies have made some really big efforts to track these exploit kits, and the commercial sources are much more current. And this, of course, is also part of what they're trying to do as their quote competitive advantage in providing the best product that they can as well. And I think there are differences there. With that, I think I'll got 2 minutes early here, so I'll finish up there. Thanks very much. Hope you guys all have a good day.